First of all, I'd like to thank Paul and Tom for inviting me to this wonderful opportunity. My mother was a teacher in Chicago public school, so I respect teachers a great deal. And also, on my mother's side, the entire family had been teachers, actually, going back to the 19th century. And now I teach at UC San Diego in the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Unfortunately, we mainly teach master's students, so your students will, 4 years from today, they will hopefully become our students at GPS. So as per request by Paul and others, I'm going to talk about the ruling party of China today, and that is the Chinese Communist Party. And I think, for Americans, students, and just Americans in general, I think it's important to notice that there are key differences between the political system of China and the political system of the United States. Even though, of course, there are ruling political parties in both cases. In the case of China, the ruling party has been in charge of the country since 1949, right? So it's been the same party. And the other thing to notice is that the Chinese Communist Party, which is the ruling party, spent the first 30 years of its existence as a revolutionary party, and I would add also a successful revolutionary party, because otherwise it wouldn't be in charge of China now. And the opposition to the Chinese Communist Party was the KMT, which of course is still in existence in Taiwan, as many of you know. The KMT was also a revolutionary party. On top of that, it was backed by US money by the 1940s. Billions of dollars of US weapons, money, advising, and still it lost to the Chinese Communist Party, which, although it was backed by some Soviet money, it didn't come close to matching, as far as we know, the amount of money that the Americans gave to the KMT. So it is a successful revolutionary party, and so then you say, well, how did it win? And I think the answer, one key answer to why the Chinese Communist Party won was because organizationally it was so much more powerful than the KMT, and many of these organizational features continue to be there within the Chinese Communist Party. And because the Chinese Communist Party is the ruling party of China, it continues to affect all walks of society in China, right? So I think it's a basic lesson that people have to know about the ruling party of China. So what are some of these features of a revolutionary party? So first of all, it is a Leninist party with, so what does that mean? And I don't know if some of you will get to that at the high school level. I think so, right? Like in your AP European history, you can talk about Leninist party, the rise of the Soviet Union. A key feature of that, of course, is a strict chain of command and basically an elite selection of leaders, right? So leaders are not selected by and large bottom up, although there are some features that they call it democratic centrism, there's vaguely democratic, but by and large, the party secretaries at each level are really selected by the party committee at a higher level. So it's kind of this top-down leadership selection. And as a result, party members at each level are supposed to be strictly obedient to the instructions of the party from a higher level. They can complain about it, they can have input, but when a higher level makes a decision, a party leader at a lower level, they're supposed to obey, right? So it's very different from kind of like, especially these days, young people, it's like, well, I feel like I don't need to obey this. And no, that's not going to go in the Chinese Communist Party. You have to obey. There is extensive, so a secret for its victory in China was that the Chinese Communist Party had extensive grassroots organizations in all walks of life. I mean, when it was a revolutionary party, I wouldn't say infiltrated, but it was behind a lot of student organizations, which started protests and all kinds of stuff, gave the KMT a lot of trouble. These days, the grassroots organization of the Chinese Communist Party is everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. There are party cells in all the companies, larger companies in China, companies with 100 employees or above. They're not just state-owned enterprises. The latest effort of the United Front's department, which is in charge of spreading the party everywhere, is now making a major push to have party cells in foreign companies, foreign invested enterprises operating in China, private enterprises. There's an effort to actually recruit the children of wealthy people in China so that they can be Communist Party members. All the education institutions in China, without exception, I would say, have a party committee. Can anyone think of any exceptions? I mean, NYU Shanghai, maybe, possibly. But I bet that there is a party committee there also. All the media of China, everything. How many of your schools have Confucius Institute? The Confucius Institute, probably not at the level of the high school level, but the one layer above, you know, whatever organization in California is in charge of all the Confucius Institutes in California, there is a party secretary, there's a party committee. That's not to say that it's evil or whatever, it's just there's a Chinese Communist Party committee which exists for every organization that is related to China. Okay, so again, top-down accountability, party leader accountable mainly to higher level party committees instead of grassroots inputs. The party maintains strict control over all organizations of China, as I pointed out, especially organizations, of course, that control means of violence. So all police forces, the military, you know, there are these urban management people, which, you know, everyone hates, you know, to go around like beating up vendors and so on and so forth. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, has party cells, party committees, which control all of these organizations. Okay. So when you join the Chinese Communist Party now, today, you still have to say this pledge. This is still today the CCP Pledge of Allegiance. There are a couple of things that are worth noticing here. One is secrecy, right? So there's an emphasis on secrecy. You have to guard party secrets. Again, that's a legacy of the fact that it was a revolutionary party, had to fight against a government, but this legacy of secrecy continues to exist. You know, so that's why the people in the Chinese government, they usually don't like to reveal the fact that there's a party committee controlling the Confucius Institute, but the reality is that there is, right? And then the other thing, of course, is that as a revolutionary party, you want you know, fanatics basically to work for you. And even though, of course, Communist Party members today are not fanatic most of the time, at least, it still is in the pledge that party members stand ready at all times to sacrifice their lives, their all, right, whatever that means, including lives, for the party and for the people of China. This is one interesting thing about China, which is that because the party hierarchy is very strict, the administrative hierarchy also is very strict, right? So in China, the government is divided into all these different layers, and all the resources and power, of course, go to the highest level, which is central government residing in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai. Below that, there's a provincial level, which is similar to the state level in the United States. Below that, you have prefecture, which is kind of like major cities like San Francisco or Oakland or something like that. And then there are counties below that. So when you ask somebody in China, so there was a funny situation actually recently in Seattle with the Xi Jinping visit. So when Xi Jinping was visiting also a major bank in China, which is ICBC, actually, I think by some measure, like the third largest bank in the world or something like that. And the head of ICBC, so ICBC was going to open up a branch in Seattle. The head of ICBC was coming in. The head of ICBC has a rank that's vice ministerial, which is the same as vice provincial. So you see the province there is just half a step below the provincial level. But the governor of the state was busy, so he couldn't attend. He's like, well, you know, we have the mayor of Seattle here, and also the King County executive, which in Seattle is a big deal. You know, it's like executive for Orange County or something like that. A pretty major local official to welcome you, who's you know, a vice ministerial level official from China, and this head of ICBC was very, very offended because in China, when you're a minister or vice minister, you go visit somewhere, another vice minister has to welcome you, right? Otherwise, it's like a total loss of face. Because like, well, how can you have an inferior official welcome me, who's a higher level official? So for them, these ranking are very, very important. And then also, I think more importantly, for ordinary people in China, all the resources flow upward. So then when you ask somebody like, oh, like my students are a perfect example. So like, well, are you willing to live in a county? And they all say, no, no, no. We don't want to be living in a county because they have like really bad schools and like bad public services. But I say, well, people in the US would be very happy if they were organic farmers in Orange County, right? Because that means you're like rich or something. That is not the case in China. I mean, everyone is trying to leave the county level. They're trying to be not farmers because farmers are heavily discriminated against. And part of the discrimination stems from the fact that people know that farmers reside in places with really poor, by and large, most of the time, poor public goods provision and therefore poor schooling. And then most people are trying to get into cities, especially Beijing, because Beijing, being the capital city of China, has all of the best resources, the best schools, the best hospitals, and so on and so forth. And that's why housing prices in Beijing is just insane, basically. The parties everywhere. So there's a overlapping government principle in China, which is that at every level, right? Whether it's the county level or in the city or the state level or the central level, there's usually the head of state. So there's a mayor, right? So let's say San Francisco, there would be a mayor of San Francisco. So China has that. But also there would be the person who's actually in charge would be the party secretary of the city. So San Francisco, if it were in China, besides the mayor of San Francisco, you would also have a party secretary of the Chinese Communist Party who would be, in most cases, the person who's actually in charge, right? So when you go visit China, it doesn't matter whether let's say you do an exchange with another high school or something in China, you get introduced to the principal of the school. You also have to ask, hey, by the way, who's the party secretary of the school? Because that's a person who's really in charge. And then they'll tell you and say, oh yeah, this party secretary is this other person over there. And then when you're drinking your liquor that they always serve you when you do an exchange, you go to the party secretary and drink the liquor, not the principal, because the principal is not actually in charge of that much. So this is the system across all levels of government, all public institutions, I would say, and schools, hospitals, universities, everything. That's how that operates, and including a lot of state-owned enterprises, right? So every state organ has a party committee or party cell, which include most of, if not all, senior leaders in that organ. And most of the time, so there's a party committee basically in every university, every school, every levels of government, and that party committee, it would be similar to like a board of directors. So you can imagine like if all public institutions and all major companies in China, companies already have boards, like boards of directors, but you can imagine a similar board existing in schools, hospitals, universities, everything. And that board, who are all senior level party members in that institutions, would make all the major decisions, right? Like who gets promoted, who's going to get raises sometimes, what curriculum to use. I mean, the curriculum actually is decided at a very high level now, at the central level. Some party organs, such as the propaganda department in China, in reality control multiple state organs, right? So the propaganda department is a perfect example. The propaganda department's jurisdiction is very broad. They're now in charge of all the TV stations, all newspapers, all internet portals in China, right? For internet portals, because many of them are privately owned, they don't control the day-to-day operation. In contrast to a lot of national newspapers. Internet portals, there's a system, well, so that's a separate discussion. There's now a jurisdictional battle between a party organ which controls the internet versus the traditional powerhouse, which is the propaganda department. But these are the institutions that send out, I'm sure you guys have read about like thousands of censors to make sure that nothing subversive appears on the internet. So in sum, the reach of the party is very, very extensive, and it's universal. I mean, I think there's a saying that, well, the Chinese Communist Party is like God. You don't see them, and they're everywhere, except the Chinese Communist Party. You do see them, and they're everywhere, something like that. I think that's the joke. So again, there's always a party, and then there's a state. The state at the central level is organized as such, and it's very similar to almost the United States or Great Britain or something like that. There's a premier of China who is Li Keqiang at this time. There are several vice premiers, each with some kind of jurisdiction. So there's a vice premier in charge of agriculture, there's a vice premier in charge of industrial policy, and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of ministries, which again, very similar to the US departments, or in the UK, they're also like different ministries. But at the same time, in the central government of China, the more important set of organizations are party organizations, which again exist in parallel with the state organizations. So basically, the single most powerful organization in China, perhaps at this point, I mean, the single most powerful person in China, without question at this point, is Xi Jinping, who's the party secretary general of the Chinese Communist Party. Traditionally, the single most powerful organization in China is the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is a collection of very high-level party officials, including the party secretary general, who's Xi Jinping at this time, and this organization make decisions on every major policy in China, traditionally. Now, I think things have changed a little bit, and power has migrated even more into the hands of one person, i.e. Xi Jinping. But traditionally, at least, the Standing Committee would make decisions on every major policy. When I say every major policy in China, I mean every major policy and a lot of minor policies. So, how much growth there would be in China, the Standing Committee voted on it. Who gets to be the next governor of Shanxi province, the Standing Committee would vote on that. Industrial policy, what sectors to put an emphasis on, whether it's IT or, electric cars or something like that. The Standing Committee would vote on that. I even heard once that the Standing Committee voted on whether a movie star can appear on Chinese media in the future. So there was this woman, Tang Wei, who, I don't know how many of you have seen this movie, Lust, Caution, which is a pretty controversial movie. And basically, after seeing the movie, he's like, oh, this is too controversial. The star in this movie shall not appear in Chinese media anymore. And indeed, this person was banned from appearing in any media in China for the next 6-7 years or something like that. I mean, I think the ban has been lifted, fortunately for her. So traditionally very powerful, but what recently has happened is that Xi Jinping has tried to circumvent the power of the Standing Committee by forming a bunch of leading groups in different policy areas and naming himself as the head of all the different leading groups, right? So instead of having all these different policies decided by the Standing Committee, which for China is relatively democratic, Xi Jinping has said, well, I'm just going to sidestep this by having a leading group on economic policy, having a leading group on security affairs, leading group on this and that, on internet security, and I'm the head and the agenda maker for every single one of these leading groups. Then I don't need you guys anymore. I don't need the rest of the people in the Politburo Standing Committee. So a very obvious centralization of power has been happening in China. But as you can see also that, let's see. Yeah, so under the the party in Beijing also has a bunch of different departments which are in charge of different things. There's propaganda department, which of course controls all the media in China. There's something very important traditionally for Leninist party's organization department. So the organization department is like the human resource department for the Chinese Communist Party, and it compiles files and has a lot of influence over the appointment of all the senior officials in China. So you can imagine, like, it's like having one HR department deciding on who's going to be the next governor of Arkansas, Florida, and and who's going to be the mayor of New Orleans, Washington D.C., New York City, and so on and so forth. That is the case in China. Basically, you have one human resource department which keeps the files, keeps track of the accomplishments and faults of all the senior level officials in China. So all the ministers, all the governors, and so on and so forth. Okay, so Tom already showed this picture, but these are the people who are in the Politburo Standing Committee. And of course, these days, it all comes down to one person, the person in the upper left-hand corner, Xi Jinping. He is amassing a vast amount of power. And to me, at least, it seems like he has concentrated more power than even Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China in the 1980s. And his power, at least today, within the government is rival that of Chairman Mao, of course, the first leader of the People's Republic of China. But if you look at the formal procedures, actually internally there's supposed to be quite a bit of democracy within the Chinese Communist Party. Internally, the way that the party secretary general is selected is actually pretty similar to what you're seeing on TV today, like the DNC or the RNC. Every 5 years, there's supposed to be a party congress, and the party congressional delegates are supposed to elect the Central Committee, which is a much smaller body of people. So here's the part where it's different from the DNC or an RNC. In the RNC and DNC, the party congressional delegates directly elect the presidential candidate, or in China's case, the party secretary general. In China, there's a two-step process where the congressional delegates will elect the Central Committee, and then the Central Committee will elect the head of the party secretary general. So that's the nominal procedure, but in reality, the way that leadership selection works is highly top-down, right? So as we're saying, as a Leninist party is totally top-down, the way that works is that the current members of the Politburo Standing Committee would nominate candidates for future participation in the Politburo Standing Committee, and also nominate candidates for the party secretary general. Then there is this mysterious black boxy process that nobody inside or outside the Chinese Communist Party really understands, where there's informal consultation, right? So, but then it's like, who gets to be consulted? Definitely, as far as we know, current members of the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee, as well as past member of the Politburo Standing Committee. So this is why these retired senior level officials are often seen as still having a lot of influence, because they are included in this consultation process. There's also some vetting by the Central Organization Department, of course, the HR department for the entire Communist Party. Then when there's a consensus, and then the consensus part is the part that nobody knows how it works. Then there's a formal nomination, and then it goes through the votes. So that's how, as far as we can tell from the outside, that's how the Chinese Communist Party works. What are some of the pitfalls and merits of how it is organized? I think it's really important to discuss this. So the merits, the most commonly discussed merits of the Chinese Communist Party is that it is, because it controls everything, it is able to mobilize sometimes unimaginable resources very quickly. Right? So when there's an earthquake, when there's some kind of natural disaster, the Chinese Communist Party can order all the local governments, the military, the banks to act simultaneously. And that's something that's really hard for even the federal government to do. Like, oh, the National Guard wouldn't come, or like is not ordered to come, or whatever. There's all kinds of political hurdles that potentially doesn't exist in China. It doesn't mean that they respond to every crisis very fast. Sometimes they're very slow, but it's not because they can't. It's because they won't do it, right? If they really want to do it, they can do it. Potentially, again, very rapid policy making. There's no Congress blocking this and that. If the party secretary general and Politburo Standing Committee decides on something, that's it, right? So they can sit down, discuss it for half an hour, and make policy. That's not always good though, because issues are complex. But when there's an emergency, maybe sometimes you do need very fast responses, right? The command structure can make policy implementation very rapid and thorough, right? So part of my work is on the financial system of China, and people always ask me, why hasn't there been a financial crisis in China? I mean, the debt level is unimaginable. There's like a credit bubble that's like, much bigger than the one that US had back in 2009, yet no crisis. And the reason is because the buyer and the sellers of financial securities in China are both controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So as long as the party, a crisis happens when, like, let's say you hold a stock or a bond and you panic, you're like, oh my God, this is worth nothing, I'm gonna sell it right away, and everybody does it, then that's when you have financial crisis. But if the party says, even if you think what you're holding is worth nothing, you cannot sell it. So that's basically what the party has done. So that's why there hasn't been a financial crisis in China, because they control everything. They control the banks, all the brokers, all the mutual funds, all the insurance companies. And they tell all of these organizations, doesn't matter what you think the assets that you're holding is worth, you just cannot sell it. So they don't sell. There's no crisis, right? We can discuss whether that's a good thing or not. Some of the problems with this organization structure, unchecked power, right, which leads to corruption, expropriation, human rights violations. So this is a very well-known problem in China, obviously. Because the party controls the court, grievances against the government cannot find independent adjudication, right? At the local level, the party secretary controls the police, the court. I mean, that's changing slightly. The Anti-Corruption Investigation Bureau, and the government. So if you're abused by the government, there's literally nowhere to go except for a higher level government, right? See, the echoing chamber effect, which is if a top leader supports a bad policy, no one dares to dispute that. Right? Because, of course, the party secretary, especially if the top leader of China, Xi Jinping, believes in something that's wrong, people are not going to stand up and say, wait a minute, this is totally wrong. They'll say, oh yeah, that's a brilliant idea. Let's do it, right? So even well-meaning policy reflects the preferences of a small handful of elite. Sometimes serious problems are not addressed until the elite realize the urgency of the problem. So these are all the pitfalls. So some very quick examples. Of course, during the Wenchuan earthquake, the CCP mobilized vast resources and literally rebuilt these cities which have been destroyed by the earthquake in the space of 2 years. Of course, the rebuilding, some of it is very shoddy and so on and so forth, but nonetheless, can you imagine the US doing this in New Orleans? We just say, okay, we'll just build the city anew, in 2 years' time. Unimaginable. China can do it. The problem is that, because the hierarchy is so strict and all the resources go to Beijing, at the rural level, local level, in some rural counties, they receive very little policy attention and very little resources, and so you see a lot of problems building up in rural areas.
That previous picture, I apologize, that's trash, or is that...
That's trash. That's trash, yeah. There are a lot of white elephant projects all over China because the local leadership, which is in charge of everything in that city, will say, oh yeah, let's build a brand new district, residential district over here that's very inconvenient, nobody wants to live there. It gets built, but nobody lives there. So there are a lot of ghost cities in China, so this is another manifestation. And because people cannot redress grievances in courts, they find very extreme means of addressing their grievances. So this is someone who's set themselves on fire and jumped outside a window because their abode, their home, is about to be torn apart by the local government, right? So this happens a lot in China. I'll skip this. It creates a lot of uncertainties, basically, one-party regimes, because there's no accurate gauge of like who is more powerful, right? Here you can do opinion polls and say, oh, 40% supports Clinton, 40% supports Trump, or whatever. In China, there's no such thing, and so it makes politics pretty messy. And during Q&A, I'm going to leave up some helpful resources. The first two linkages are official Chinese government websites, but it contains a lot of useful information about how the government is organized. China Digital Times, I think, is the single best website for contemporary China. It includes all kinds of news, and it's pretty objective. Sina is a Chinese website. And then there are two think tanks that are doing a lot of papers on contemporary China, Merix, which is in Germany, and CSIS, which is in Washington, D.C., and then there are some like helpful websites on economics, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Victor. What's your first question?
Hi there. Can you expand on how the upward flow of resources, as well as the distribution of wealth in China, affects the implementation of policies across different provinces and townships, and how policy implementation varies across different areas?
Yeah, this is a struggle for the Chinese government. There is some, I think that at the central level, there is some departments which would like to see more equitable distribution of resources, and so for some things like teachers' pay. So teachers' pay in China is not funded by the local governments. It's funded by one single bank account in the central government. And every month, the central government literally just send direct deposits to all the teachers' bank accounts in China. So, every month, some amount of money will appear in every teacher's bank account, and it's directly from the central government. And so they've made the formal part of teachers' pay equitable. But of course, the problem is that is not the only component of a teacher's pay in China. So a teacher in China will try to squeeze their students by holding special tutorial sessions after school and make like students pay. And of course, in poor areas, your students are not able to pay like a high fee for the tutorials, but in Shanghai, in a very good school, students literally will pay tens of thousands of US dollars a year for their tutorials, and some of these high school teachers are quite wealthy, actually. They're driving Porsches. So, if you want to be a wealthy teacher, definitely move to China. I mean, you can, if you play your cards right, you can really make a lot of money. I know. Actually, I've been offered. Back in the day, I would be like a multi-millionaire had I taken an offer one time. Yeah, exactly.
I have a question. We have about 30 or 40 international students from China, because I teach in a private school, and like many private high schools in the U.S., we have international students who can pay full tuition. I think that's part of the motivation, and it would be really helpful for them, I think, to have a good comparison of U.S. government and Chinese government, because one of the first classes they take at our school is U.S. history, and so I think the systems are. It was interesting, the parallels that you drew. I just wonder if there's a good resource that draws these different comparisons between the structure of Chinese government and American government for high school students.
Yeah, I mean, I really think there is, I think direct them to US websites. I mean, there are pretty good websites for the US government, Library of Congress, and I don't know what else there is. But what I often notice is that among my Chinese students, their knowledge of their own government is very low. So even when you're teaching Chinese students, you have to explain to them how the Chinese government works, because of course, as a dictatorship or authoritarian regime, the government has no incentive teaching a citizen how the government works. In fact, they prefer it if people are pretty ignorant about actually how the government operates. I mean, they teach them like lessons of patriotism, as Tom and Jeff mentioned, like century of humiliation and blah, 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 and this is why the Communist Party should rule. But in terms of procedures and organization, I find that among my students, at least, they're very ignorant about how that works. And it's helpful to point them towards some of these resources that I put online, so that they can, especially even the official one, the gov.cn is quite helpful, and just They have a Chinese version, so your Chinese students can look at the Chinese version. But especially China Digital Times will, especially on news flows, very good news flows for your Chinese students. And besides the fact that it's not a democracy, the other big difference really is fiscal federalism, which is that Orange County's resources come from Orange counties, and it's a very wealthy county because there are a lot of wealthy people living there, and so they have a lot of resources. That is not the case in China by and large, right?
Just a quick question. It sounds to me that you were talking about the party being everywhere, and is this one of the issues for American companies in doing business in China? Is that when they set up an office in Beijing or Shanghai, the party then comes to them and says, well, we're going to have our party members join the board, or we're going to join this. And then it seems sinister and somewhat nefarious to us to have that. Are they seen within China as being responsible for reporting back to the party for what's going on in that company?
Yeah, of course, right? And sometimes they don't even tell you. They just form a party cell, right? Because, it's quasi-secretive. Their effort is much more public and say, well, we're just going to form a party cell. And, I would say it's not always very sinister. Of course, there have been cases of like commercial secret theft and this kind of stuff. But mainly what the Chinese Communist Party really is trying to do is make sure that, A, they know what's happening in every segment of society, especially the views of the people and especially the elite. And sometimes it could be helpful, right? So if there's a big earthquake or something like that, some of your employees will immediately know which part of the government to contact and where to get help and resources. So that could be helpful, right? Because they're always in contact with the government in some sense, right?
This is the last question before the break.
Yes, hi. I'm just curious, with the recent consolidation of power with the Secretary General, is there any pushback within the party or the ruling committee to try to regain some influence? And what would be your predictions of what that would mean for the party in the next couple decades?
Oh, wow, that's a very good question. If we knew, yeah, there has been some very subtle pushback, but very subtle. The problem is that Xi Jinping now has control over the military, or more control over the military than any other civilian leaders of China. Also has, as far as we can tell, fairly good control over the internal security apparatus. It's like the KGB type things in China. And given that, the other leaders, even if they don't like what's happening, it's really hard for them to be too public about their opposition. So right now, there's a lot of very subtle signs here and there. Although we keep hearing rumors that the one remaining person who could challenge him could be going to jail soon. But he keeps not going to jail. So actually, that's very interesting because the rumors of him going to jail, this guy, Li Yuanchao, who went to the Kennedy School for a year to study, the rumors about him going to jail keeps appearing. I just saw him smiling on a tour to Hong Kong. So not in jail yet. We'll see. But why is he not in jail? Maybe because some other forces are trying to prevent him from going to jail, and maybe that's successful. We don't know. Although my base case is that Xi Jinping will be very dominant at the 19th Party Congress. It's kind of like their election next year, which will happen next year. And once he consolidates power, I don't expect him to retire ever until he dies. So I think we will have an era of Xi Jinping, short of some big shock like economic crisis or war, God forbid, war with somebody. I think Xi Jinping will more or less be in power until he passes away, just like Chairman Mao.